Back in 1988, South Central Los Angeles was already like a powder keg waiting to blow. The streets were under constant pressure, not just from gangs and poverty, but from a police department that treated entire communities like enemy territory. This was the height of the war on drugs, and the LAPD was operating more like a domestic military force than a group of public servants. People were used to helicopters buzzing low, used to seeing patrol cars slow roll past them like predators. But even in that charged atmosphere, no one was prepared for what happened on August 1st. That morning, before the sun was even up, the LAPD stormed a block of residential homes on 39th and Dalton Avenue like they were invading a foreign country. It wasn't just a few officers with a search warrant, it was dozens of armed cops in riot gear, smashing through doors, screaming at sleeping families, destroying everything in sight. And they had the wrong target. The raid was based on the claim that a major crack cocaine operation was running out of those homes. But the so-called intel they used to justify this full-force invasion? It was barely more than street rumors and some vague statements from people trying to stay out of jail. There was no actual surveillance, no undercover buys, no verified proof. Just a thin stack of reports filled with assumptions and anonymous tips. But in 1980s LA, that was enough, because when the neighborhood was poor and mostly black, it didn't take much to get a green light. The LAPD had been fed this idea that all it took to clean up the city was brute force, and they took that idea to heart. So they launched a militarized raid with 88 officers. Think about that for a second. 88 cops in full gear, descending on a quiet block like it was an active war zone. And when the raid hit, it hit hard. People were asleep in their beds. Children were in pajamas. Some folks were getting ready for work. They had no idea what was coming. Then suddenly their doors were flying off the hinges. Walls were being torn apart, and officers were shouting commands with guns pointed at heads. It wasn't just a search. It was a demolition job. They busted through 5 homes in a row. They flipped over furniture, punched holes in drywall, ripped open ceilings, tore out plumbing like they were expecting to find drug stashes hidden inside. But here's the kicker. They didn't find a cartel. They didn't find kilos of crack or rooms filled with guns. They found families, grandparents, toddlers, parents screaming, confused, terrified. And the cops, instead of stepping back and realizing they were in the wrong place, they doubled down. They had to make it look like they had something to show for it. So they arrested 37 people, most of them young black men, even though they hadn't found what they were supposedly looking for. And almost none of those arrests led to convictions. Once the dust settled, the charges started falling apart. A lot of people were released because there was no real evidence. Some were picked up for things that had nothing to do with drugs at all: loitering, resisting, interfering with police. Basically, they were arrested because the LAPD needed warm bodies to prove their raid wasn't a complete disaster. One man was tackled and cuffed just because he happened to be walking by. Another was arrested because he asked too many questions. And even those who were released didn't get their lives back. Their names were smeared. They missed work, lost jobs, were evicted. The damage wasn't just physical. It was reputational. The police had labeled that block as a crack den, and that label stuck long after the case collapsed. Then came the cleanup, or rather, the lack of it. The LAPD didn't pay to repair the damage. They didn't offer counseling or support to the families who'd just been terrorized. They didn't even apologize. The residents were left standing in their destroyed homes, walls busted open, furniture trashed, wondering how they were going to explain this to their landlords or to their kids. Some of the homes were so badly damaged that they were declared uninhabitable, but the city washed its hands of the whole thing. The message was clear. If the LAPD kicks in your door and wrecks your life, that's your problem, not theirs. And the worst part? No one was held accountable. The officers involved weren't punished. No one in command was fired. In fact, many of them continued to climb the ranks. And that's the scariest part of all this, how easy it was for this to happen. There was no oversight, no requirement to prove the raid was necessary. No one in the department stopped and said, "Hey, maybe we need more than a rumor before we send a small army into people's homes." The system allowed this to happen because it was designed to trust the police above all else, especially when the victims were poor and black. And the LAPD knew it. They knew they could raid that block, destroy property, traumatize families, and walk away without any consequences. That's what made the Dalton raid so dangerous. It showed just how fragile your rights become when someone powerful decides you don't deserve them anymore. Eventually, the residents fought back the only way they could, through the courts. They filed lawsuits. They told their stories to anyone who would listen. And years later, after a long legal battle, the city finally settled. But by then, the damage was done. The money didn't make people feel safe again. It didn't erase the nightmares. It didn't fix the reputation of that block. The kids who watched their parents get dragged out of their homes at gunpoint didn't just go back to normal, and the public barely remembered. The media had already moved on. There were no headlines when the city paid out, no updates on what happened to those families, just silence. And if this had been a one-time thing, maybe people could write it off as a tragic mistake. But it wasn't. The same tactics used in the Dalton raid were used over and over again, especially in South LA. No-knock warrants, militarized raids, mass arrests with little to no evidence. It became part of the playbook. The war on drugs gave the LAPD a blank check, and they cashed it in at the expense of entire neighborhoods. Even when the public started calling for reform, even when the department got new leadership, those tactics didn't go away. They just got quieter, slicker, better disguised. The Dalton Avenue raid should have been a turning point. It should have sparked a real conversation about policing, about the value of truth over force, about the cost of treating communities like war zones. But instead, it became another file in a long cabinet of scandals the city would rather forget. And for the people who lived through it, that silence is almost worse than the raid itself, because it tells them their pain didn't matter, their truth didn't count, and that next time, it could happen again. So yeah, the LAPD raid on Dalton Avenue didn't just destroy a few houses, it shattered a community's trust in the people who were supposed to protect them. And when that kind of trust is broken, when the system shows you it sees you as a threat instead of a neighbor, it doesn't rebuild overnight. Sometimes, it doesn't rebuild at all.